del PAPIIT que yo coordino junto con mis colegas, y también Gran, Luciana Inzanata y otros más que andan por aquí. Es un honor cerrar 3 años de actividades con la presencia de Susan Buck-Morss. La verdad es que estamos muy, muy contentas de haber logrado que viniera. Ella tiene una agenda muy ocupada, entonces realmente agendamos esto hace casi 1 año y medio, un par de años, donde dijo, este es el momento, y por suerte nuestro proyecto justo va a terminar acabando este evento. Susan Buck-Morss es una de las más importantes filósofas de la actualidad. Es conocida originalmente por su trabajo sobre Adorno, el origen de la dialéctica negativa, y sobre Walter Benjamin, la dialéctica de la mirada. Su interés por pensar el tiempo presente y encontrar los vínculos que nos pueden llevar a pensar y por lo tanto nombrar otra política la ha llevado a poner en tensión lo que entendemos comúnmente por historia universal. Libros como Hegel y Haití hacen y ponen esa tensión. Es una filósofa comprometida con nuestro tiempo. En el año 2000 se publica Mundo soñado y catástrofe, la desaparición de la utopía de masas en el este y el oeste. Se trata de una investigación monumental, donde Susan ya empieza con algo que va a ser hoy también, a mostrarnos y a investigar a partir de las imágenes. Y digamos que es un momento extraordinario donde se vincula toda una experiencia entre este y oeste. Y su más reciente libro, Pensar tras el terror, también cava sobre las dicotomías que nos impiden quizá ver eso que queremos nombrar como una historia común dentro de las singularidades. Pensar tras el terror trata sobre el islamismo político en un momento justamente donde era muy importante desestructurar esta idea de Islam, musulmanes son terroristas. Yo le doy la palabra a Mina Navarro, que es la que nos va a guiar en esta primera conferencia, y les recuerdo que tenemos un seminario los días martes y viernes. Hubo una dirección electrónica para que se registraran, y que el día miércoles a esta misma hora tenemos la segunda conferencia de Susan Buck-Morss. Gracias.
Bueno, pues buenas tardes. Sin más, le damos la palabra a Susan Buck, y después la idea es que podamos pasar con el profesor José Gandarilla y la profesora Raquel Gutiérrez para que hagan una serie de comentarios, de intervenciones también en torno a la presentación de su...
Should I start now? Okay. And I can go to there or not? Should I do it from here?
Where do you feel more comfortable?
Well, if the light is better here, I'm expected to stay here.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, you can stay.
Okay, sorry. Whether I should stand or sit. I get to sit, and that's very nice. Christina will be translating brilliantly for me, and I'm very happy about that. And I thank my hosts enormously for the chance to be at UNAM. It's my first visit here, and it's a very, very impressive place about which I've heard so much over the years. So Margara and Danielle and everyone else who has been so kind to me since my late arrival because of snow in New York City about a day and a half ago. Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. What I want to talk to you about today is really a provocation, and it's a question, and it's a hypothesis. This is nothing that can be demonstrated empirically, because I'm going to be speaking about the very latest political happenings in many places in the world, and we know that these movements or these events that are happening every place from Egypt to Mexico City to Wall Street in New York are unknown as far as their future is concerned. and as a scientist, but also as a theorist, and also as someone who follows Walter Benjamin's approach to history, I think that it's very important how we interpret events, the future that the events actually have. In other words, we are, in our reflections on the events, helping to shape what they will mean for us in the future. And it's in that spirit that I have written this text. And it's a text that I have given in 2 other locations, changed but with the same kind of positive political message in the last 4 months. Malaysia and Istanbul. And here I am now in Mexico City. And of course, I give it in New York City. So these are different places, different contexts in which this hypothesis is being delivered for a discussion and for let's hope, some positive political results. So it should be a question to you, and therefore one that I'm sure, based on the quality of people who surround me for the discussion, we will be able to make some progress with during this afternoon. Okay, so I'm going to begin just with an opening paragraph and then show some images that will be cued from here because we don't have the thing for me to work it from the stage. And just to say the obvious, that the world has recently witnessed massive popular demonstrations that in the name of democracy have occupied public space and in the process of the occupation itself have had the experience of living differently within it. This is not just an organization of people that march. It's an attempt to actually behave differently in public space from previous demonstrations. While the demonstrators have managed to hold crucial sites in parks and squares of urban centers, police brutality against them became integral to what almost all of the protests were about. Now, remarkable is the fact that these have taken place in nations that, despite varying degrees of authoritarianism or even corruption, have at least some claim to democratic form. They have popular elections, multiple parties, civilian executives. They are not officially totalitarian states. The list of collective actions is long, and it is global in scope. With those opening words, I would like to show you some examples of these demonstrations. These are roughly in chronological order, beginning with Tunis in 2011. So let's have the first. Yes, the first is Tunis, and they've just had a very successful constitution, which is a secular constitution. So this is really seen as some real progress, although it's an Islamic government that's in place. The second one, of course, Tahrir, the first time around. The next, the time that Mubarak was forced to leave because of the force of this global crowd. Libya, Bahrain, and Yemen, the West Bank of Palestine. And now we are in, I'm blocking where we are, Indignados in Madrid, of course. And this is also Madrid. And here we are in Greece, Malawi, South Africa, Damascus, Tel Aviv, New York. And stop just there to say one thing. It did not originate in New York City. Very important. This is something where New York copied the Middle East. What an interesting situation. Next. this wonderful phrase, we are the 99%. I think this is really quite brilliant. 100% is a totalitarian number, but 99 tells you that the system does not work for many people, right? The next. This is an anti-capitalist movement. The next. In Beijing, your head down. Okay. And these are translations, I trust, they're correct. In other words, this was a small movement in Beijing, but it was a response to what was happening elsewhere in the globe. The next. Rome. Again, can you move your head a little bit because the dates are covered? Thank you. Me too. Next. Obviously, Italy. Athens. The next. Moscow. Now that's 1 year, 2011. Okay? Now we're in 2012. Portugal. This is in Malaysia. And when I put these up, they're not the only ones, but they give you an idea of the expanse across the world in which these demonstrations have occurred. Bologna. And, you know. And the next. And the next. I put in lots for you. And stop here a moment. I think this is where you stop. Yes. No. No. Okay, so this is the end of this year, I think. The next one. The next. Oh, and this is Mexico City, of course. I'm sorry. The next. Argentina. The next. The Zapatistas at the end of the year, December. Yes? The end of 2012. 2013. We are in Cairo. Now, let's stop here a moment. Of course, this is coming out against the Morsi government. So one has to know that these political situations are very distinct and local. But the crowd has a force that it is self-aware about when it acts in public space. The next. Gezi Park in Istanbul. If you don't know about this, a wonderful, wonderful demonstration, really important in the lives of the Turkish public. The next, this is Sao Paulo, and then Rio de Janeiro, and Korea, Kiev. Okay, stop here. Okay, so that's just giving you, and I know you know about most of them, but you probably don't know about all of those places. How absolutely widespread these movements have been. Okay, we look now at women's rights. And this has been a constant theme. Stop here just to see the variety of women who are part of this. This is a diverse group. This is not some group that sees itself as one cultural phenomenon or one religious phenomenon or one notion of what modernity might be. This is a very diverse crowd, and that is one of the distinguishing characteristics in each of the locations. Next. 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 And next. Okay, just stop there. That's just a series to show you that these kinds of issues move around as well. Okay, let's go to what comes next. I hope I know. Oh, stop here. So, translocal solidarities. What I find, it's very important, and this will be the point that I make really in the talk, is that people are aware of what's happening elsewhere, and they are seeing that movement as relevant to their own political concerns. So if we have the next slide. This was when Egypt, Tahrir Square, inspired people in Wisconsin to occupy the Capitol and protest against the government which was trying to kill the unions. But they were taking their lead from Egypt, right? In the heartland of the United States. The next, this is in this is Ireland, I think, is it? I can't see. Ireland. Yeah, Ireland and Istanbul, a kind of solidarity there. The next one. The next. Here we are all Greek. These were people in New York City. This is this word çapulcu. Çapulcu is the word for hooligan, for thug. And this is the word the Turkish government used against the protesters. And so my friend Noam Chomsky had his picture taken for the web saying, "I am also a cup of school." And the next. And this was, can you read that? I guess it's Japanese. And the next. That's, of course, New York. I love living in New York because that was in solidarity with you in Mexico City. So we're going to stop there. And I will do some reading. But I wanted to give you a visual idea of the specifics of the multiple locations. So these are specific local actions, and they have been handled by national governments in very different ways, with radically diverse consequences. But the specifics of each case should not blind us to the fact that together they constitute a global event, initiating a new space for politics, one that I am calling a translocal commons. While each is embedded in a specific local logic, the issues sparking the demonstrations are not unique to one particular nation. Weakening commitment to social welfare programs, neoliberal policies, yes? Uprooting established communities for urban gentrification, privatization for profit of public services, rising student costs. I hear you still don't pay anything, but you're going to have to fight this for the next decade, not to have a tuition required for study. It's wonderful that you still have this, but not without a struggle. Environmental degradation for corporate gain, corruption of public officials, and lack of governmental responsiveness to the needs of the majority of citizens. In many cases, certainly this was true of the Occupy movements in the United States, the protesters were criticized for their failure to voice positive alternatives and their lack of focus on organizing as a political group or a new political party that might take the fight to an election, to a ballot box. Their refusal to play by the rules of national elections and representative legislatures should not be dismissed as mere incompetence or laziness. Rather, it manifests a growing awareness that the roots of the problem are not national in scope, nor is a remedy possible on a purely national level. These mass protests in urban public space were pro-democracy, but more significantly, they were redefining what in our age of global interconnectedness the idea of democracy might mean. The neoliberal global order that was constructed after the Cold War has brought us an unregulated but integrated global capitalist system of finance, production, and consumption. It has brought us a global democratization of the economic elite that is now far more evenly distributed across the world's nations and peoples than was the case in the early post-colonial decades. I mean, there are very, very wealthy people, in Russia and in the Gulf states and in Mexico City and whatever. So the 1% is very democratized. But it has done so at the expense of an intensified class divide, the often cited growing gap between rich and poor, and a global surplus of populations, people who no longer provide the systemic necessity of what Marx called a reserve army of the unemployed. They are, in the United States, we are coming back from an economic crisis, but the jobs are not increasing in number. So there are certain superfluous populations that are not even having the function of a reserve army of the unemployed. The locations of this superfluous workforce are spread like an archipelago throughout the system, which increasingly relies on computerized processes for greater productivity, eliminating human labor in many occupations. Only the most poorly paid workers, the young women in Bangladesh garment factories, the young men in Africa's mining industries, the immigrant labor force in U.S. meat slaughtering plants, or domestic servants throughout the cities of the world, only these are still absorbed by global capital with apparent ease, often under shocking conditions of exploitation. In this context, the middle class that was supposed to provide the basis of liberal democracies is threatened as well, because in many social contexts, the middle class is disappearing. And even if their standard of living is momentarily on the rise, their quality of life suffers from the very forces that cause it to rise. Now, a central concern of all the nations of the world is this: how are national governments to negotiate between the interests of global capital and the interests of their own citizens? Given the disparity of power between economic elites, the infamous 1%, and the vast majority of the population, it is not easy to see how state governments or national governments can play an effective role as a mediator to deliver economic security for its citizens. And indeed, we find in the United States that the government and this is Obama, this is our liberal regime, finds that what makes a success as an economic policy is to save capitalism, right? And even if that does not help the working class, it doesn't matter. This notion of playing a mediating role is essentially one that makes your own country strong for capitalism, for global investment, etc. The reasons that this national solution is not working are structural. Volatile and prone to crisis as it is, capitalism is nonetheless a system, one that has to grow in order to survive. And as nations compete to attract capitalist investment, the dynamics of growth take place side by side with sidelining social costs and turning a blind eye to environmental degradation, worker safety, and the non-profitable aspects of human existence, i.e. old age, illness, public education for all. These become maybe not so important to support as they would have been even 50 years ago. The universalization of this situation that undergirds the politics of every nation in the world changes qualitatively the conditions of possibility of democracy. Today, democracy has become, this is my hypothesis, a global struggle. National governments try to play us off against each other, But if we don't have some sort of awareness of the need to have solidarity globally in order to produce a democracy that is worthy of the name, we have to do it together. The temporal imaginary of development theory, the belief that nations as discrete entities were moving at different speeds through necessary stages of economic modernization as a prerequisite for democratic transformation, the idea essentially that some nations were behind and others were advanced in what was an inevitable set of stages that every nation would have to go through. This idea, this temporal imaginary, no longer holds. Democracy needs to be reimagined without a stagist temporal apparatus, and moreover, without the conceptual limits of national borders. All of us occupy the same political time zone. No one's advanced, no one's progressed. We're all right here now. When the world's citizens are held apart by discourses of national difference, politics is staged competitively as a struggle at home against the economic welfare of national populations elsewhere, no matter how politically allied those nations may be. So you have, for instance, German workers blaming Greek workers for the economic crisis, or American workers blaming Mexican immigrants for their economic situation, right? Etc. Not only between nations, but also within them. Specific identity groups see others as an enemy that is holding them back. As these perceptions play themselves out within conventional nation-state politics, they lead to ethnic, racial, and religious riots, an escalation of hatred against the other, right, that in the most extreme cases have as a consequence civil war. So these are the shared realities within which the new citizen actions have emerged. Now, I don't know if I should go through all this, but I'll try it simply. Carl Schmitt has a term which I tried to see if I could find a translation for, the state of emergency or state of exception. I think you would say estado de emergencia or estado de excepción, yes? This is the Schmittian notion, yes? In English, when you say state of emergency, you can play on a double meaning of the word emergency, because the word emergence is a kind of anticipation of something new, whereas the Schmittian, Carl Schmitt's idea of a state of emergency is the state is threatened. And when the state is threatened, the government has justification to suspend the Constitution, to suspend the laws, etc., in order to protect the Constitution, protect the laws in this paradox where only the state is necessary to save, right? And so if we take this word, state of emergency, and turn it around and use it as an anticipation of something new, we appropriate this crisis language for a different political agenda. Now, there are many reactionary demonstrations in the world today. We have anti-gay demonstrations, we have anti-immigrant demonstrations, we have a Thailand demonstration that is very, very violent and pro-monarchy and tries to present itself as some sort of Thailand Spring, but is nothing like that. But what determines then the distinction between those that are really reactionary and those that are not? It seems to me the importance is precisely this confidence in a state of emergency of something new, a kind of anticipation of something new. Participants in the progressive movements range demographically over every age group and economic sector, but mainly they come from the young with a precarious future in front of them. They are most often urban dwellers, or at least they are globally networked. They are accustomed to inhabiting a multicultural, multiracial space, even multilingual. Right? And we can talk about the Zapatistas in this context too, because they have they are connected to other movements in the world, and they are themselves a multilingual movement. Right? So there is a kind of affirmation of diversity, as opposed to a setting up of barriers between us and them, that characterizes a demonstration that has this kind of anticipatory potential. And crucially, of course, they are skilled in the newly decisive political technologies of social media. Okay, so now here is going to be that's the idea of the translocal, yes? Now I'm going to introduce this notion of the global crowd, right? And I'm going to do it as a force, a political force, that is not, it's a new political animal in the human gene pool. We can call it the global crowd. What are we to make of this new massive assemblage of humanity? Will it evolve as a permanent power on the political landscape? Or will it become, as a new political animal, an endangered species, hounded by surveillance mechanisms into an early extinction? The global crowd is amorphous, anonymous, and it is still discovering its powers. Its capacity to survive in the present political climate is as yet unknown. But to speak together, producing collective voices within a translocal commons, is to enhance its potential. The global crowd is not an object to be described by intellectuals, but it is a composite of ourselves. Our speaking of, to, and with the global crowd nurtures its self-awareness with the power of critique. Its potential is our own. Now, the global crowd differs from what used to be called, in a derogatory fashion, the mob, because of the sophisticated use of the new social media that acts as a kind of transpersonal, decentralized brain, allowing the collective to self-organize. The crowd was always seen as without a head, as totally irrational, right? But now, because of this capacity to instantly communicate, it has a consciousness and a shared consciousness which allows for self-reflective action, even in the moment of the action itself. It creates a web of relationships among people, a social fabric of trust that weighs lightly yet strongly on participants, whose potentially limitless number is its strength. The crowd's horizontal interconnectedness, enabled by the new media, distinguishes it from the irrational crowd, the forms described by Gustave Le Bon at the turn of the 20th century, as a massification of individuals who lose their capacity for self-reflection. The global crowd differs as well from the old-style working class. Unions collaborate with it, but unions are not its monolithic composition. New labor movements challenge older unions that have adjusted to a corporate model of national compromise and have therefore lost their militancy. Workers are increasingly dependent on translocal political action because, and here you can consider the terrible fate of the women workers in the textile factory in Bangladesh, their struggle needs global solidarity of consumers in cities elsewhere in order to expose and resist the practices of global capitalism or global corporations that are getting away, literally, with murder. The global crowd, in my estimation, is also not the multitude. I'm referring here, of course, to the work of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, who have given the global citizenry that designation, the multitude. It was in the year 2000. We have all learned a great deal from their path-breaking work, now already more than a decade old, that analyzed and affirmed the political promise of globalization. But it seems to me that the multitude has taken a new shape with the recent actions of the global crowd. There is something too passive about the word multitude as a description of contemporary political action, and also something too differentiated, focused on simply a multiplicity of experiences, whereas the present global actors are working in an anticipatory way to produce a unity of practice rather than simply a multicultural ensemble of identities. And they are working together against the emergency forces deployed by state power. So the multitude was an idea of there are many identities and we're all diverse together, but this is a kind of coming together, no matter what your identity, in order to act together in political space. And this is a different phenomenon, it seems to me. This unity, this solidarity across differences is essential for effective action within the political time zone that is now globally shared. If the global crowd has affinities to earlier forms, it is in the tradition perhaps of Bakhtin. Bakhtin's crowd, which was carnivalesque collectivity that enacts a changed social order, the idea of acting, performing the different world. Right? This is, to me, extremely important. People practice living together without the mediations of political representation or capitalist exchange. The global crowd is generic. The word in French is générique. The word in English is species being. The word in Marx's 1844 manuscripts is Gattungswesen. This notion of generic in that sense, right? The Feuerbachian notion of species being, as interpreted by Marx, producing a translocal commons in the name of a democracy to come. So there is something about a universal notion of humanity that comes through this Marxian concept of species being, or I think probably you are closer to the French who call it générique. Yeah? So what if not ethnicity or class is the new basis of solidarity? Consider the following example. It developed spontaneously in Cairo during the height of the 2011 Arab Spring. People who came together in Tahrir Square as a united force to get rid of the old regime gave each other their cell phone numbers in order to remain in contact as a political force. They gave their individual first names, but the last name for all of them was Tahrir. So you would have Laila Tahrir, Abdullah Tahrir, Mohammed Tahrir, etc. The all-powerful patronym, your father's last name, was not there. That's the name, of course, that determines your race. It determines your property. It determines your position, therefore, in society. It may determine your religion. that was replaced, that name was replaced by the same name, the name of a public space that symbolizes a new citizen unity, and this is new, enacts that unity for a global audience that is invited and encouraged to replicate this unity in their own locales, so that the imagined community transcends national difference. These actions anticipate a not yet realized possibility of what the global practice of democracy might mean. Democracy is not merely a question of winning an election, but of governing for the benefit of the people, all the people. So, I mean, people are saying capitalism doesn't work for workers. You know, it doesn't work. So, how can you say that it's a system that needs to be maintained if it's not working for the people who actually work to produce the wealth? The life of the crowd in the the life of the crowd in the public commons performs this understanding for the world to see. It's a new anarchism, and it is not the anarchism of the past or the avant-garde, because it's a kind of horizontal democracy of the global crowd in action that is anticipatory of a changed democratic goal. And the internet is not merely a means of propagating information, but also now a method of organizing and a weapon of tactical improvisation within crowd action itself. It is worth noting that the global crowd's discontinuous history, that is, it comes out here and here and here, and dispersed chain of events is well documented and remarkably accessible in digital form. Wikipedia has been fantastic. I mean, most of these images that I got are from Wikipedia, right? They're documenting the history of these global movements with amazing speed and accuracy. Okay, now I'm going to go and show you some slides again about this, to make a point about this new political animal, right? The global crowd. Okay, now this is very familiar, I hope, to you, because you're in a political science department and you know this is the frontispiece to Thomas Hobbes' famous book, Leviathan. And this is the sovereign, the Leviathan, the human-made God, right, who is ruling over the people. Could I have the next slide? You can see now in this detail that the people are all individuals within the body, but the body is contained by the skin of the sovereign. And it produces a division, right? And the sovereign, of course, has now become the sovereign state, or the nation state. So these are the boundaries that produce the edge of a concept of common citizenry. Okay? Yes, thank you. This one. This is very important. Keep this on for a moment. We're going to see two more slides that are rather similar. The point I want to make here is that in the contemporary notion of the Leviathan, of the nation state and the sovereign, composed of the people, there is always the figure of the leader that encases or represents the people. So the next one, this is Lenin, I'm sorry. He also has his face made up of little people, and the next, this is Woodrow Wilson. This was a favorite visual image of the boundaries of the nation state in the early 20th century. So the point here is that this new political animal, the global crowd, is not producing an alliance to a leader. This is not national populism. And even in the case of Comandante Marcos, his leadership is by denying leadership. And so this is a very new phenomenon, and it's very widely shared, and it is made possible to a large extent by the new social media. And the next, I am 132. What does it mean? I could be anyone, right? And there is no one saying that I can't be it. There is no leader who says, no, I am 132, and there's no one else who's allowed in, right? So there is this horizontal democracy, which is, and this is the word I'm bringing in here, this new political animal is a body without organs, but it is, that's the Deleuzian term, of course, but it's a body without the largest human organ, which is the skin. There is no edge to this techno-leviathan, no boundaries to its habitat, no place where it cannot live. It cannot commit treason. It cannot be bound by the neoliberal idea of social contract. There are no limits to the possibilities of integumentary exchange. Integumentary is a word I found in Wikipedia, actually. It simply means the ability, like the skin exhumes perspiration and brings in warmth, this capacity to actually be a membrane that connects as opposed to produces a boundary of separation. The global crowd roams the world and does so as a force of image production, deeply embedded in living beings. Images, and I'm quoting, bodies and struggles form part of the same dynamic. This transformation from mass communication to masses that communicate, transformation from mass communication to the masses that communicate, overturns the power relations of mass culture from inside the belly of the beast. So we're actually, it's a mass organization, but it's one that actually internally communicates. Yes. The actions of the global crowd are open to shared experience, a shared life beyond differences in identity. The Lebanese writer Rabbi Murray speaks of a pixelated revolution captured and recorded by cell phone videos that are uploaded and go viral as counter images to the official news channels, which, as we all know, are not in favor of publicizing or televising revolutions. Murray claims that even in the case of the Syrian civil war, resistance is staged in a secular zone where the violence of the regime is recorded by the prosthetic eye of the cell phone camera and streamed to the world as an appeal to human judgment, not a performance before God. Now, how can the world see? Now, the question, of course, is misplaced. The issue is rather, how do demonstrators premise their political action on being seen, not by their national leader, not by the state, but by the world, a vision that circumvents state surveillance and makes public evidence no longer a vulnerability to protesters, but a weapon. It's good to be seen in masses. If you're seen as an individual, you're in danger. But if you're seen as 100,000, it's strength and protection. President Mubarak on state television, speaking paternalistically to his people, appears foolish on Al Jazeera in the split screen alongside Tahrir Square protesters waving shoes and shouting him down. He's a mere man, like any other, and they call on him to resign. Here, the gaze of national power has lost its capacity to lock in the meaning of political actions because the people are no longer his to address. Now, no doubt, the strength of numbers in the global crowd is its weakness as well. The spontaneity that brings success is immediate, but it is evanescent. It is temporary. Because the crowd maximizes the use of social media, it does not need a party base, and consequently, of course, it doesn't have one. We can see how tragically vulnerable, or how tragically this vulnerability played itself out in the case of Egypt. And I'll move very quickly here, but we know that the Muslim Brotherhood was the only organization that pre-existed Tahrir Square in a established enough way to win the national election, which it did, right? And the global crowd was not prepared to combat that at the level of the elections at that moment. But it seems to me when the crowd came back to Tahrir Square in order to ask Morsi to resign 2 years before his term was over, that was really an error. They went for the military. They trusted the military to get rid of Morsi. And you know, of course, what happened. There were over 1,000 Islamic supporters of Morsi who were killed. And right now the situation is quite dire because the military has the same control that it had before. And it seems to me that that was really a mistake because Morsi did not have the support of the army. And so even if he had tried to do the Schmittian notion of declaring a state of emergency, he didn't have power behind him to realize his aims. So this, it seems to me, was really a mistake. And it shows the weakness, which is obvious in the case of a global crowd, which is spontaneously organized, but hasn't got that organizational roots deep in community life. So events in Egypt, I'm skipping ahead, show us just how difficult it is for a new democratic force to emerge on the global stage. If in 2011, Egyptians assembling in Tahrir Square inspired the whole world with enthusiasm, in 2013, events were framed by the Egyptian military within narrowly national terms. And this now is my complaint also against President Obama's response in Egypt and also in Syria. President Obama acted too in old ways, both liberal and national, claiming publicly that this was something for the Egyptian people, right, to decide for themselves. No one talks about the economic and political elites as having to simply be acting in the narrow confines of a single nation state, but the people have to be confined in this way. Now, this sounds very tolerant, but it cuts the global crowd into manageable pieces for state control, whereas the radical potential is that these movements will overflow national borders. How do the Egyptian people define themselves? There is no simple answer. Public opinion polls looking for the decisive identity variables, this is what you find the social scientists doing, do they see themselves as Arab or as Muslim or as Egyptian, or how do they see themselves? What they find is that they have multiple identities and that these are shifting in their importance. They don't say, I am Egyptian, therefore I have a certain politics, but I am acting in a certain way. And that may be in defense of being Egyptian, or it may not. The action is important. It precedes the identity. Okay? So rather than deriving their politics from their identities, global crowds negotiate the content of these designations as the consequence of their actions, not its cause. In proclaiming to the world, the state does not represent us, right? Crowds demonstrate that it is through them and not through their officials that the meaning of words such as America or Egypt or Syria or Greece, how it is decided and communicated to people. I mean, I can say my government does not represent me, right? which is certainly true in, I want to say 99% of the cases, maybe not that high. But the point is that I have a right to say the state does not represent me. And as an individual, I do that, but I have no power. If I can do it with hundreds of thousands, millions in a public square, then there is a force that has to be reckoned with. So my point is that for the global crowd, what is newly emerging is the idea that politics is not determined by identity. Not who you are is crucial, but the fact that you are willing to stand with others in public space as an embodiment of the general will. General in the generic sense of a transnational humanity. However, the politics of global democracy is only a possibility within our shared political time zone, not the rule. The definition of democracy as an ethno-national project, where other cultures or religions or ethnicities are lucky if they are recognized as minorities within the nation, this remains the dominant form. Now, I'm going to skip, because this goes slowly when I pay attention to the needs of the translator and just listening to a foreign language. We can talk about specific cases. I mean, of course, what I want to say is that nation states exist on some premise of racism. In the case of the Americas, successive waves of forced labor were codified in taxonomies of difference by means of the pseudoscience of race. Today in the United States, this is very interesting, in the United States, the word race is not mentioned because you don't want to say African Americans are a different race. Everyone knows that's not politically correct. But the category of white is not. It is not wrong to talk about the whites, right? And to recognize in political discourse that the demographic threat is now to the whites in the United States. They feel it and they talk about it in public space, right? The whites who came over on the Mayflower, the good ones, the ones that killed the Indians first, these are the ones who have some prior right to the occupied territory. And of course, it's clear it's not going to be a white country in a matter of less than a decade, I believe. And this is seen as a political threat. This is pure racism. It's pure racism, even though we have a black president and we are supposedly beyond this kind of thing. And we could go into the problems in Latin American countries as well, but we won't. We will instead move on to. I want to talk about. One point here that's important. Neoliberalism has its own fantasy of global unity, whereby the reciprocity of trade and economic interdependence is supposed to lead us, as Immanuel Kant said it would, to global peace. Now, this idea we trade together, we're interdependent, and that's going to lead to global peace. This is a fantasy that is very much alive in nation-state discourse. And when I was in Malaysia, it was quite interesting to discover in the recent history that one of the most successful presidents for one of the longest periods of time came up with this definition of Malaysia as Malaysia, Inc., Incorporated. In other words, to think of it as a business arrangement among a variety of ethnic groups, the Malays, who speak Malaysian, the Chinese, who are a very large minority, and then there are, I think, 18 different other ethnicities. And they should see themselves as allied in some sort of corporation. And so the metaphor of the corporation was very much alive in that situation. So the idea of economic harmony based on mutual exchange as a means of transcending economic conflict based on class it has become a central tenet of neoliberalism in the post-Cold War era. You hear people talking about, we're going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem by having them all be economically interdependent. Well, you know what that's going to end up meaning. But this is supposedly to break down every other difference, right? The fantasy of economic interdependence as bringing peace. It has become a central tenet of neoliberalism in the post-Cold War era. It is supposed to have made communal and collective ways of living together obsolete, preventing what Jacques Derrida called the specter of Marx from making its presence felt in political life. And yet that past persists in the social unconscious. The specter of Marx stirs in the thickets of memory of the global crowd as well. The events that happen that matter politically are also globally shared. And again, what's interesting is they do not start in the United States or Europe. They start in other places and move then to supposedly the advanced developed world. This is why this political time zone has become so horizontal, as opposed to a notion of stagist development. We know, of course, the Asian economic boom came to a sudden end in 1997. The financial crisis hit not only Malaysia, but Thailand, Philippines, Korea, Hong Kong, and Japan. Again, as anticipatory of a decade crisis of the global capitalist system that spread around the world. Argentina, 1998, Turkey in the year 2000, the United States, 2008, the Eurozone in 2009. In Malaysia, recovery by official channels required a bailout of key industries as well as further dependence on global financial institutions and controls, with the biggest sacrifices made domestically by unions and by social programs. To the rest of us in the world, whether we are American or European, Asian or African, none of this is news. All of these developments are familiar as effects of global capitalism in our own countries. And yet, despite extraordinary similarities in the economic situation, the sad truth is that throughout the world, appeals to racism and religious intolerance have proven effective as a means of national politics in response to this situation. In the global wake of the capitalist financial crisis, divide and rule has managed to prevent the specter of Marx's return. Now, it is here that the global crowd finds a foothold as an alternative to both capitalism and Marxism. I think now I need my last... Yeah, we could put the last slide on. This one. This, if Google Translate is any good, is what to do, sto delat, this wonderful phrase that Lenin, in multiple languages, some of which I don't even really know, but you feed it into, couldn't even tell you which one is which, but it's in a lot of languages there. What to do, right? It is here that the global crowd finds a foothold as an alternative to both capitalism and Marxism. At the same time, given existing political institutions, it is not a replacement for national citizenry. Religious, linguistic, racial, sexual differences are not obliterated in the crowd. Instead, they are celebrated. Theirs is not an abstract argument about universal human rights. Rather, citizen variety is displayed as an affirmation of the fact that the political issues that matter are not commensurate with differences in identity. Practical issues are precisely the principle of assembly of the global crowd. As a forum in which the meanings of the nation or of religion or ethnicity are negotiated in full view for the world to judge. Moreover, its strategic positioning on the internet, wherein information speedily travels beyond the geographical boundaries of the nation-state, highlights the fact that the place in which national politics plays out is not confined to a specific geographical location. And consider in this context, I'm not going to give my bad take of this because you know it much better than I, but the July 2012 demonstrations against the election of Enrique Peña Nieto, Nieto's apparent win over López Obrador in the country's presidential election, replacing Calderón, and you know this whole history, so I'm not going to go through it again, but simply to say that this movement, Soy 532, this movement was called itself the Mexican Spring, so it understood itself in a context that was indeed global. This movement claimed that no candidate spoke for them. They understood themselves, you understood yourselves, as expressing a political sentiment that motivated the participants in the demonstrations of the Arab Spring. So this, again, is a leaderless movement and one that has a sense, an affinity with a kind of global sensibility that is emerging, that is new. When I was in Istanbul, just anecdotally, the Gezi spirit, we saw pictures of Taksim Square. That was where the police came down heavily. It was also where the CNN had their cameras. But behind that was Gezi Park. And the reason why the demonstration started is that there was a plan to destroy the park, and there's not much green park left in Istanbul, and to make this crazy, to destroy it, to rebuild a replica of the army barracks of the Ottoman Empire, and then to turn that rebuilt Ottoman army barracks into a shopping mall. And that was going to replace Gezi Park. So this is what instigated the movement. Everyone I spoke to in Istanbul was amazed because people came to that square to stand together who don't even pay much attention to each other in social spaces otherwise. So you had Islamists breaking Ramadan there. You had anti-capitalist Islamists together with gay rights activists and feminists, and the most amazing thing to all the groups that might at least have seen themselves on the left was when the soccer fans, when the football fans came out in support, because the football fans are seen as very reactionary and on the right, and they all came out, and there was a great cheer just to see the variety of humanity that was standing there together. So, in other words, again, it's not you have to look like us, you have to act like us, you have to go into another space and always be together with us. No, but you sense a solidarity across these differences. And that was a revelation to those who participated, the hundreds of thousands who participated for many days in the occupation of Gezi Park. So my closing comments. So what is democracy in global terms? The promise and the hope provided by the global crowd is precisely the possibility of unifying people's struggles across the boundaries of nations on a basis other than ethnic, religious, or class belonging, all categories of distinguishing friends from enemies based on who they are, rather than the truly political ground of where on the issues they stand. The slippages within political naming have never been more extreme. No one even knows what's on the left, what's on the right, whatever. The need to translate local terms for a global audience marks a change in the political horizon. with the disillusionment of the dream that capitalism would be sufficient for a political harmonization of interests, coming close on the heels of another failed dream, that Marx's historical predictions would inevitably be realized, the global crowd has emerged as a space of democratic experimentation. Its history is yet to be written. So we might look at it this way, because they're operating in a space that traditionally was off bounds for any political movement, because it goes outside of imaginary of the nation state. Translocally, the global crowd occupies a space traditionally monopolized by interstate diplomacy. In its progressive forms, it democratizes this space. It is anarchist insofar as the people, not their government leaders, appeal directly to the world and negotiate recognition of their place within it. Whereas traditional democracy is secret, the diplomacy of the global crowd makes publicity its practice. Traditional diplomacy mediates cultural exchanges via state-approved forms. The diplomacy of the global crowd produces its own shared culture, street art, political performance, as well as a shared mass culture of popular music, independent cinema, documentaries, fashions, viral videos, tweets, Facebook postings, open source software, cell phone directories, and more. Those who participate in the global economy, at no matter what income level, have access to at least part of this media arsenal, particularly young people, and demographic trends are in their favor. The effects of this new diplomacy are not yet tested. The capacity of the global crowd to improve traditional institutional orders is a conjecture and a hope. Its actions so far have appeared to be easily overpowered by state violence, power politics, nationalist enthusiasm, and proxy wars. But the global crowd's enormous potential as a political force will not simply disappear. It is vital that the crowd's participants remain visible to each other. States and corporations must be prevented from controlling the global field of meaning. Not just freedom of expression is at stake. The new media must be kept open and publicly available, because publicity is the only antidote to a monopoly of the Internet's revolutionary technology for the purposes of capitalist wealth accumulation and population surveillance that defines the interests of global corporations and what the Turks call the deep state. That's the part of the state that will never be democratized. Nothing will be more critical for the meaning of democracy in the future than the struggle against state and corporate appropriation of media information that denies access to it by the global crowd. The global crowd is a power bloc. It takes its place among other power blocs, including BRICS as an alternative to Western hegemony, or the EU, the European Union, or the Chinese state's bid for superpower status. These are other political agents in the global arena, as are national political parties, labor unions, and religious institutions. But the global crowd as a power bloc is unique in these ways. One, it has no bars to entry. Two, it performs for a worldwide public. 3, its political effectiveness depends on a synchronicity of actions within our shared political time zone. It has the power to challenge the practices of the national security state and of global capitalism alike. The very fact that it is a player in global space, not the only one, but the one most open to the world's immensely varied populations, varied religions, varied genders, varied languages, varied traditions, anticipates a changing world order, one with weak boundaries and shifting names, shifting nominations. And it brings to international diplomacy something that this field, international diplomacy, has never even pretended to deploy in its most enlightened Western forms, and that is democracy. The Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 is the founding document of the international order under which we still operate, and it's based on secrecy and not at all on any principle of democracy, never pretended to be that, right? My last point, my last sentence. Not the technology of global communication, but the claim to democratize global space by means of it. This marks what is new in the present situation. To speak about, to, and with this global crowd is to help it to emerge. Thank you.